He suspected a theft. What he uncovered was far worse. When tech magnate Nathaniel Morgan installs cameras in his mansion, he expects to catch a petty thief. Instead, he watches in silence as his own wife strikes the young housemaid, a girl too quiet, too thin, too used to being hurt. No screams, no resistance, just the sound of a slap and a silence that speaks louder than anything. From that moment on, Nate must decide, protect the image of a perfect life or fight for someone who never had one. Stay with us, because this isn't just a story of injustice. It's a journey of guilt, healing, and the quiet power of being seen. Nathaniel Nate Morgan didn't believe in chaos, at least not the kind that couldn't be debugged or quantified. As the founder of one of the most influential tech empires in Seattle, his days revolved around precision, systems, and control. So when Claire, his wife of 3 years, mentioned that items were going missing around the house, a watch here, a perfume bottle there, Nate responded not with emotion, but with a solution. He had his team discreetly install 3 micro-cameras in key locations: the hallway near the bedrooms, the kitchen, and the master suite. He didn't tell Claire, he didn't tell the staff. It wasn't about trust, it was about data. Let the footage speak, let the numbers make the decision. He told himself it was better than accusing anyone unjustly. But underneath his logic, there was something darker, a small, gnawing disquiet that had been growing inside him since Claire started spending more time at home. She had a sharp way of watching people, especially Alina, the young maid who never spoke unless spoken to. Claire never said it aloud, but Nate noticed the tension, the looks, the way Alina seemed to shrink into herself whenever Claire entered the room. Still, he assumed it was nothing. Just social friction, something common in households like his. 3 days later, Nate sat down in his office with a cup of coffee and opened the laptop. The motion alerts had captured several clips, most of them uneventful. Alina folding towels, vacuuming near the stairs, picking up a book someone left on the floor. Then came the file from the master bedroom. The time code blinked 2:18 p.m. The room was bright. Claire stood near the edge of the bed, holding a pillow in one hand. Alina was by the window, folding sheets with careful precision. The audio was on. Nate adjusted his headphones. At first, the conversation seemed normal, Claire asking about the linens, Alina answering softly, but then the shift came. Claire's tone sharpened. She stepped closer, questioned why the bed had been changed without her explicit instruction. Alina apologized. "I thought," she began. "You don't get paid to think," Claire snapped. Then, without further warning, her hand lashed out, striking Alina across the face with a velocity that stunned Nate. The sound of it was sharp, final. Alina didn't scream. She staggered back, caught herself on the edge of the mattress, and sat down, holding her cheek. There was no fight in her, no defense, just breathless stillness. Claire stood above her like nothing had happened. Nate paused the video. His hand hovered over the trackpad. Then, almost without thinking, he rewound it and watched it again. Not out of disbelief, but out of a sick need to be sure. Maybe the sound had exaggerated the moment. Maybe it had been less than it looked. But no. On second viewing, it was worse. The slap wasn't impulsive, it was deliberate. There was no flinch in Claire's face, just contempt. And Alina's stillness afterward, her refusal to cry or speak, told Nate this wasn't the first time. He pressed pause and stared at the frozen image on the screen. Alina sitting on the bed, eyes low, her right hand covering the side of her face, shoulders drawn inward. Claire was already walking away, as if done with a chore. Nate leaned back in his chair. Something pressed against his chest. Not rage, not yet. Shame, maybe, or the realization that everything he thought he controlled was already rotting at the foundation. He had built this house with glass and order, yes, but it had become a stage for cruelty he hadn't bothered to see. He thought about Alina's first day. How quiet she had been, not timid, precise, everything in its place. No wasted movements, no mistakes. The agency had spoken highly of her. She'd come from Detroit, left college after her mother passed, and worked to support her younger brother. She never asked for help, never spoke of her past. She just cleaned, efficiently, silently. Claire hadn't liked her from the beginning, said she was too quiet, said she was watching everything. Nate had brushed it off as tension. Some women don't like other women in their space, he'd told himself. But this was something else. He wondered how many times this had happened, how many bruises Alina had covered with makeup, how many times she'd lied when he asked, "Are you okay?" And how many times he'd chosen to believe her answer instead of the truth behind her eyes. His stomach twisted. The slap was loud, but the silence after it, that was louder. That silence was the part that wouldn't let him breathe. Nate shut the laptop, then opened it again. He needed to be sure, needed to check the timestamp, the angle, anything that could prove this wasn't imagined. But everything about the recording was real, undeniably real. He stared at the progress bar, his finger hovering over the space bar to replay it one more time. Instead, he minimized the window. For a long time, he sat still, replaying it in his head anyway. The problem wasn't just Claire, it was him. He had seen Alina flinch in the past, had noticed the tension, the way she never met Claire's eyes. He had watched her work past midnight, arriving earlier than everyone, leaving last. She was thinner than when she started, quieter. And still, he'd never asked the question in a way that really demanded an answer, because deep down, he didn't want to know. The truth would require action. And Nate Morgan didn't like messy outcomes. He liked things clean, efficient, logical. But this wasn't logical. This was human. And now he couldn't unsee it, couldn't pretend the house he'd filled with art, light, and soundproof glass was still something good. The image of Alina, small, silent, holding her cheek like she was trying not to exist, stayed burned into his mind. The slap was a scar, but it was the stillness after that gutted him. That's when the weight settled in, not just of the violence itself, but of how long it had gone unspoken. Nate had built everything, his wealth, his reputation, his home, on order. But now he realized order wasn't peace. It was silence, and silence, he finally understood, could be just as cruel as a slap across the face. So he clicked play again, watched it a second time, and for the first time in years, the world he'd so carefully designed began to crumble, not from the outside, but from within. Alina arrived at 7:53 a.m. sharp, as she always did. Nate saw her through the kitchen doorway as she stepped in, clutching her canvas bag to her side like it held more than just cleaning supplies. Her uniform was immaculate as always, but her face told a different story. The concealer didn't quite cover the swelling on her right cheekbone, and the small tremor in her jaw when she smiled looked more like muscle memory than emotion. She greeted Marta, the housekeeper, with a polite nod and a "good morning," but didn't linger. She moved through the house like a whisper, each step deliberate, each motion rehearsed. When she picked up the squeegee and a bottle of window spray, her hands barely paused. She headed for the front room, the one with the high windows Claire had always obsessed over. Nate followed, keeping his distance, not sure what to say, only that he needed to say something. But before he could speak, Alina turned, saw him, and instinctively muttered, "Sorry, sir." Just that. No eye contact, no hesitation. An automatic apology, as if her very presence might have been an inconvenience. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching her wipe down the same pane 3 times, even though there wasn't a single smudge left. Her motions were slow, precise, almost mechanical, like she wasn't cleaning glass, but counting seconds. She didn't speak again, and he didn't interrupt. He couldn't, not when the word sorry echoed in his mind louder than any explanation. It wasn't just the apology itself, it was the way she said it, as if she owed the world for occupying space in it, as if breathing too loud might get her in trouble. Nate had met countless people in his career, executives, investors, analysts, but he'd never seen anyone so carefully erase their own presence. Alina didn't move like someone serving a household. She moved like someone surviving one. She checked the corners of the window twice more, even though they didn't need it, then paused to fix the bottle's label so it faced forward. When she finally stepped away, her hand brushed a photo frame on the table, and it shifted slightly. She immediately whispered, "Sorry," and adjusted it back even though Nate hadn't reacted. That word again. Always that word. He cleared his throat gently. "Alina." She stiffened. Her hands froze around the edge of the cloth she was folding. He waited. "Are you—" He didn't finish the question. She turned halfway toward him, her face neutral, her eyes tired, unreadable. "Yes, sir," she said, like someone answering a courtroom judge. He hesitated. "Are you okay?" The silence that followed wasn't cold. It was calculated. She measured her answer before speaking. "Of course, sir," she said with a practiced smile. "Everything's fine." She looked down as she said it, then added softer, "Sorry." Nate almost stepped forward, but something about her tone stopped him. Not fear, not even caution, just conditioning, like a machine built to survive, not to trust. He wanted to ask about the bruise, but knew she would deny it. He wanted to tell her she didn't have to apologize for everything, but saying that to someone who'd learned to apologize just to be left alone felt naive. Worse, it felt hypocritical. Claire had trained her, maybe not deliberately, not in the way one trains a dog or a child, but through repetition and dominance, through quiet punishments and glances that made Alina fold into herself, through subtle humiliations passed off as instruction. "Don't answer unless asked." "You should be grateful." "You're lucky to be here." Phrases Nate had heard but never absorbed. And now he saw them etched into every part of the girl's behavior. She cleaned obsessively not because she was meticulous, but because she was terrified of being seen as lazy. She didn't speak because she was afraid her voice would be used against her. Every "sorry" was a defense, a wall, a lifeline. Nate leaned back against the doorframe, silent. He had allowed this, not by doing it, but by watching it happen and calling it structure, by mistaking quiet obedience for a good system. But Alina wasn't obedient. She was shrinking, disappearing by the hour. She finished the window and moved on without being told, heading for the hallway baseboards. She crouched down, toothbrush in hand, scrubbing corners no one would ever notice. Her braid fell over her shoulder, and she quickly tucked it behind her ear without looking up. Nate watched her move, and all he could think about was how many times he'd passed her without seeing her. She'd been in his house for 4 months. He knew her name, her agency, her punctuality, but not her. He didn't know her brother's name. He didn't know where she came from before Detroit. He didn't know how long she'd been absorbing blame just to make sure she wasn't sent away. He knelt down beside her, something he hadn't done in years for anyone. She looked startled, but didn't pull back. He reached for the cloth she was using and gently took it from her hand. She didn't resist, but her entire posture tensed. "You don't have to keep saying sorry," he said softly. "Not to me." She didn't reply. She just stared at the floor. Then, almost a whisper, "Sorry." It slipped out before she could stop herself. Nate stood slowly and stepped back. He didn't want to push her. He didn't want to force comfort where she had only known silence. Instead, he nodded once, more to himself than to her, and turned to leave the room. Behind him, he heard her return to the scrubbing. It wasn't that she hadn't heard him. It was that she didn't know how to accept what he said. Not yet. That would take more than a kind word. It would take consistency, presence, something no one had ever offered her without condition. And as Nate walked down the hallway, one truth sat heavy in his chest. For the first time, he felt ashamed of the word "sir." He'd spent his life earning it. She had spent hers apologizing to it, and in that imbalance he saw not hierarchy, but damage. Real, long, deep damage that no amount of wealth could erase. Only presence could begin to heal, only honesty. And maybe eventually someone telling her, again and again, that she never needed to shrink herself just to be allowed to stay. Nate had never written anyone's name on a cup before. It felt almost absurd as he did it, using a black Sharpie to print the letters with care he didn't even use for boardroom contracts. Alina. 5 simple letters. It wasn't a strategy. It wasn't a calculated act. He just wanted to make something hers, even for a moment, something small that didn't ask anything from her. That morning, as he stood in the kitchen, pouring coffee into 2 mismatched mugs, he realized how unnatural kindness had become in that house. Not that there was active cruelty in every room, just an absence of warmth so constant it had frozen everyone into survival mode. He placed the cup on the marble counter near where she usually passed first. No note, no instruction. Just the cup. Just her name. He stepped away before she entered, not wanting to force a reaction. Part of him worried she wouldn't touch it, that she'd think it was a test. But part of him, one he hadn't listened to in a long time, hoped it might make her stop moving for just 1 second. She entered the kitchen a few minutes later, hands folded, eyes alert. She noticed the cup immediately. He watched from a short distance, pretending to scroll through his phone. She looked around first, confused, then approached it slowly. Her name stood out against the ceramic, written in clean, blocky letters. She blinked, hesitated, her hand hovered. He stepped forward before she could walk away. "It's for you," he said gently. No one else was in the room. Her eyes flicked up to meet his for the briefest second. Surprise, hesitation, something softer, and then dropped again. "Thank you," she murmured, fingers wrapping around the cup as if it might disappear if she didn't hold on tight enough. She didn't sip. Not yet. Just held it like she was waiting for someone to tell her it was a mistake. Nate nodded once and walked away without saying more. He knew if he lingered, it would turn awkward. It wasn't about watching her drink it. It was about giving her something she could take without permission. Hours passed. The day unfolded quietly. Nate had a call with investors, reviewed some acquisition paperwork, answered a few emails from board members he didn't particularly care for. But his mind kept circling back to that small moment. Alina holding the cup with her name on it. It was absurd how meaningful such a thing could feel. He wasn't used to caring about small gestures. His life had been built on scale. Massive deals, global movements, data sets, but nothing in his portfolio had ever required this kind of patience, this kind of attention. He resisted the urge to go back and see if the cup was still there. He didn't want her to feel observed. That was what Claire always did. Hovered, judged, reminded people they were being watched. Nate didn't want to repeat that mistake, even unconsciously. So he stayed away. Let the moment be hers. And yet, beneath his composure, something strange stirred. A quiet sort of hope, the kind that doesn't announce itself but waits quietly to be confirmed. Late in the afternoon, after the house had settled into its usual hush, Nate returned to the kitchen to refill his glass of water. He wasn't expecting anything. He didn't even look toward the sink at first. But when he did, he stopped mid-step. The cup was gone. In its place, under a neatly folded napkin, was a note, a small one, torn from a notepad, edges uneven, handwriting neat but careful. He pulled it free and read it twice before his chest fully registered what it said. "Thank you. That was kind." 3 simple sentences, no name, no signature. Just that. He sat down slowly at the island, the note still between his fingers. In the vast landscape of his life, annual reports, signed NDAs, engraved invitations, this was the first message in a long time that felt human. It wasn't the words themselves that shook him. It was the fact that she'd left anything at all. Until now, Alina had been like air in the house, necessary, present, but barely noticed. She came and went without sound, without opinion. Now, for the first time, she had left something behind. Something that wasn't dust or dishes, but a piece of her. A gesture, not bold, not loud, but real. And it moved something in him that had been still for too long. This girl, this employee, this quiet shadow of a person who had suffered in silence under his roof, had found a way to say, "Thank you." And he, who had been thanked in headlines, honored in Forbes, toasted in champagne, felt that this was the first one that actually mattered. He placed the note inside a drawer and closed it with care, as if it was something breakable. Then he stood up, glanced once more at the space where the cup had been, and left the kitchen. The moment had passed, but its imprint lingered. Alina James had left something behind in his home that wasn't her labor. It wasn't her obedience. It wasn't her quiet. It was a presence, a human trace. And in that gesture, small and weightless on the surface, Nate Morgan felt the first subtle fracture in the wall he'd built between himself and the people around him. She had taken the cup. She had left the note. And for the first time, she had left something of herself, something no one had asked her to give. Nate opened the laptop again, already knowing which clip to look for. It wasn't the kind of compulsion he was used to. This wasn't about control, not anymore. It was something else entirely. After the coffee moment, after the note she left him, there was something inside him that had cracked, and now it was as if the footage could show him what his eyes had failed to see for months. He clicked on the timestamp for Tuesday afternoon. The laundry room. A space no one really paid attention to. The camera angle faced the folding table, part of the back counter, and the corner where the ironing board stood. In the center of the frame sat Alina, her back slightly hunched, hands cradling something small and rectangular. It took Nate a moment to understand. It was a photograph. She wasn't folding clothes or cleaning, she was just sitting still. A pause in motion he hadn't seen from her before. There was no crying, no breakdown. She simply held the picture like it was oxygen and breathed slow and steady, like someone who had mastered the art of keeping pain invisible. As he leaned in closer, he saw the photo more clearly. A boy, 8, maybe 9, smiling with front teeth missing, wearing a red hoodie and standing in front of a school bus. Alina stared at the image for a long time, thumb brushing over the corner again and again. She didn't blink much. She didn't shift. Her body was still, but it wasn't relaxed. It was a practiced kind of stillness, like someone who knew even her moments of private grief had to be silent. Nate watched her bring the photo slightly closer to her chest and rest it there for a second, then return it to her lap. That's when Claire entered the edge of the frame, on the phone, of course, her voice raised, face twisted in irritation. Nate instinctively reached for the volume, already knowing he didn't want to hear what was being said. He clicked the mute icon. The screen fell, silent, and yet somehow everything felt louder. Claire gestured wildly as she passed, not once looking at Alina, not even noticing her. And Alina didn't move either. She didn't flinch, didn't speak, didn't even glance up. She just stayed frozen, photo in hand, expression unreadable. Nate realized, in that precise moment, that the worst part wasn't what Claire had done in bursts of rage. It was what she had built quietly over time. The house wasn't just physically cold. It had been drained of oxygen long ago. Alina had learned not to exist too much, not to be noticed, not to make noise. Even now, with Claire barking into her phone just feet away, Alina didn't retreat. She didn't react, because she knew better. She had been taught that reacting could escalate things. That emotion was a luxury she wasn't allowed. Nate leaned back, eyes still on the screen, and felt something heavy and unfamiliar begin to sink in. Guilt was one thing. This was worse. This was the realization that he had walked past her in the hallways day after day, and not once had he wondered why she looked like she hadn't slept. Not once Had he asked who the boy in the picture might be, or why she folded laundry with such obsessive precision? She had been surviving in plain sight, and he had been blind by design. The image on the screen didn't change. Alina remained in the same spot for at least 5 more minutes until the timestamp rolled past 4 p.m. Claire disappeared from the frame, still yelling into her phone about some catered event. Alina finally blinked, as if that sound leaving the room gave her permission to breathe again. She tucked the photo back into her apron and slowly stood up. She smoothed out the wrinkles in her uniform, checked the folding table, and started placing freshly laundered towels into a basket like nothing had happened. Like that moment of silent remembering hadn't occurred. Nate paused the video, heart clenched. There was something deeply wrong about watching someone's quietest pain through a lens, knowing she hadn't shared it willingly. It felt invasive, but it also felt necessary. Because if he hadn't seen it with his own eyes, he wouldn't have believed just how much someone could compress themselves into near invisibility and still function. He let the screen go dark, but didn't move right away. His fingers rested on the edge of the keyboard, rigid. For all the years he'd spent building things, companies, deals, legacies, he had never considered what it meant to unbuild something. But that's what this house needed. It needed to be torn down, not in brick, but in silence. Claire's voice, even muted, still echoed in his head. The contrast between her chaos and Alina's quiet created a violence all its own. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized that the worst pain often wasn't what people screamed at you. It was what they ignored, what they refused to acknowledge. Alina had never asked for help, never even hinted. But now, through this recording, she had unknowingly handed him the truth, and it was unbearable. Nate reached out, touched the trackpad and closed the video. The file minimized into a thumbnail. For a second, he stared at the frozen frame of Alina sitting there with her brother's photo. He felt a chill, not from fear or discomfort, but from something colder, complicity. The weight of his own inaction, compounded by the luxury of pretending things were fine because he didn't want to ask hard questions. His hand shook as he shut the laptop completely. Not a tremble of nerves, but of recognition. He had created a world where silence could live comfortably. And now, the cost of that silence was etched in the outline of a girl holding on to the last photo of someone who reminded her why she had to keep going. Nate didn't cry. He didn't speak. He just sat there, trembling, while the screen went black. Nate didn't prepare a speech. He didn't rehearse his words or run the conversation through his head like he usually did before investor meetings or public statements. This wasn't that kind of confrontation. It wasn't about reputation or narrative. It was about something more primal, something closer to truth. Claire was in the dining room, scrolling through her phone and sipping red wine at 10 in the morning, as if her life was still perfectly intact. She barely glanced up when he walked in. "You're up early," she said, her tone light but sharp. He didn't respond. He sat across from her, opened the laptop, and clicked play. The video didn't need explanation. Claire tilted her head as the footage began, watching herself slap Alina without blinking. Not a twitch of shame, not even discomfort. When the video ended, Nate closed the screen and waited. Claire set her wine glass down, looked him dead in the eye, and smirked. "She's clever," she said. "Knows how to play pathetic. Girls like that always know how to draw attention." Nate's jaw tensed. "That wasn't pathetic," he said. "That was fear, and you caused it." Claire laughed, like he'd just said something ridiculous. "Oh, come on," she scoffed. "Don't be dramatic. She's not some fragile little bird. She's fine. People like her know how to survive." Nate's eyes didn't move from her. She shouldn't have to survive in this house. Claire leaned back, arms crossed, defensive. "So now you're what? Her savior?" Is this some misplaced guilt thing? Because if you think I'm going to sit here and be demonized for putting a brat in her place, you're more delusional than I thought." Nate didn't raise his voice. He didn't move. He only said, quietly, with complete finality, "You're leaving today." Claire's expression froze, then shifted to disbelief. "Excuse me?" He stood slowly. "Pack your things. You're out of this house." She stood too, now furious. "You're choosing her?" The words came out like venom, her voice rising. "Over your own wife?" Nate's response was razor-sharp. "I'm not choosing her, I'm choosing dignity." It wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. And for the first time in years, Claire had no comeback. She stared at him, blinking, searching his face for any sign that he was bluffing. But he wasn't. He meant it. Every word. Claire's face darkened, her features hardening into something Nate had seen before, but never allowed himself to fully register, a kind of cruelty that only ever appeared when she was losing control. "You're pathetic," she snapped, "letting some housemaid turn you into a fool. You always were weak when it came to women who looked like victims." Nate didn't flinch. "Get out," he repeated. Claire narrowed her eyes, then turned on her heel. "You'll regret this," she threw over her shoulder as she stormed out of the room. Her heels struck the floor like gunshots as she climbed the stairs. He didn't follow, he didn't speak. He just listened to the sounds of her packing, drawers slamming, zippers pulled. It wasn't cathartic, it wasn't victorious. It was quiet, strangely quiet. The kind of quiet that followed a storm, but not the end of it. Just the moment where you start assessing what's still standing. 23 minutes later, the front door slammed so hard the walls trembled. A photo frame on the console table tilted. A glass from the sink clinked against another. But Nate didn't move to fix any of it. He stood in the hallway, unmoving, eyes forward. Claire was gone. Just like that. No dramatic exit speech, no begging or bargaining, just rage and exit. And for the first time since he'd built this house, filled it with art and silence and symmetry, he realized it had never truly felt like his home. It had always been curated, polished, soulless. What remained now was raw space, raw. Something that might be painful, but honest. Something that could finally be reclaimed. His hands felt strange, empty, twitching. Not because he missed her, but because he hadn't acted like this in years, hadn't stood up for someone who didn't even know she deserved protection. And the power of that wasn't pride, it was clarity. He sat down on the staircase, not because he was tired, but because he needed a second to process the absence. His mind, usually a rush of numbers and decisions, was unnervingly still. The slap he'd seen in that video hadn't just hit Alina, it had hit something in him too, something buried. Claire had never physically hurt him, but she'd hollowed out rooms with her presence, demanded silence and obedience in ways that looked civil, but felt corrosive. And he had allowed it. He had watched her shape the house into a place of tension and called it marriage. That truth was harder to swallow than anything she'd said in their fight, because now he saw her clearly, and he saw himself clearly too, not as a victim, but as someone who hadn't asked enough questions, hadn't listened to the answers. And now, without her voice, without her rules, there was a different kind of silence settling in. It was still silence, yes, but not the kind that suffocated, not the kind that masked pain or restrained people into roles. This silence was open, uncertain, the silence of possibility. And as Nate remained seated on the stairs, listening to nothing in particular, he realized how different this quiet felt. For the first time, it didn't sound like submission. It didn't sound like guilt. It didn't even sound like grief. It sounded like something was beginning, not ending. Claire had left. The door had closed. The mansion had trembled. But the silence that followed didn't feel like fear. It felt like breath. Alina had always known that in houses like this, you left quietly. You didn't ask questions. You didn't wait for explanations. You just packed your things and vanished before anyone had the chance to tell you they were letting you go. So when Marta passed her in the hallway whispering, "Mrs. Morgan left this morning, bags and all," Alina froze mid-step. Her first thought wasn't relief, it was fear. If Claire had been dismissed, there was no way Alina would last another day. She had been the center of too much tension, too many hushed arguments. That kind of attention was dangerous. She moved quietly up to the small room she stayed in, where she kept her things in a corner of the closet. No real suitcase, just a canvas duffel with frayed straps. She folded her few uniforms, grabbed her toothbrush, the photo of Elijah she kept under her pillow, and began zipping the bag closed without thinking. It wasn't about justice. It was about instinct. Survive first. Process later. The fewer people you bothered, the more likely you were to leave in one piece. She didn't cry. She didn't pause. She just moved fast, like someone who had practiced this moment more than once in her life. By the time she reached the downstairs hall, her heart was thudding, not with panic, but preparation, the kind of numb readiness that takes over when you're used to being disposable. She glanced around quickly to make sure no one was near the front door, hoping to slip out without explanation. That's when she heard the soft but certain sound of shoes approaching across the hardwood. Nate. She stiffened, immediately lowering her head. Her hand tightened on the strap of the duffel. Before he could say anything, she spoke first. Automatic, instinctive, rehearsed. "It's okay," she said, barely above a whisper. "I'm leaving. I didn't mean to cause any problems." Her words were perfectly shaped, perfectly polite, and painfully hollow. She didn't expect him to stop her. She didn't even expect him to care. This was how things went. They let you stay until the guilt outweighed the convenience, and then you disappeared. But Nate didn't move aside. He stepped closer, voice calm but firm, in a way that felt different than usual. "You're not going anywhere," he said. The tone wasn't cold or formal. It was direct, like a man who had made a decision and was tired of dancing around it. Alina flinched slightly, unsure how to process the contradiction. He wasn't angry. He wasn't dismissive. He was clear. "The person who needed to leave already did," he continued, "and it wasn't you." She didn't look up right away. Her eyes remained fixed on the floor, as if even the idea of hope might shatter her carefully built armor. There was a long silence between them, not hostile, but heavy with unspoken truths. Finally, she raised her eyes slowly and met his. For one breath, one beat, she looked at him not as an employer, but as a man she was trying to decide whether she could believe. Her expression flickered, something between disbelief and confusion, edged with something even more fragile. Emotion. "You don't have to say that," she murmured. "I get it. She's your wife." The word was stung in the middle of her sentence. Nate shook his head slowly. "She was. That's over." He didn't offer details. He didn't need to. "What she did to you is something I'll never defend. I should have seen it sooner." Alina swallowed hard. Her fingers clutched the strap of the bag again. "But I'm just the help," she said, with a small, bitter laugh that didn't suit her voice. "People like me don't stay once things go bad." Nate looked at her, steady and unwavering. "People like you?" he asked. "Alina, you're the only one in this house who's done anything right for months." It wasn't flattery. It was conviction. And for the first time, Alina didn't correct him. She didn't apologize. But she also didn't relax. Not fully. Trust for someone like her didn't come from one conversation or kind gesture. It came from consistency, months, maybe years, of being treated like more than a tool. She nodded slowly, cautiously, like someone holding a gift they weren't sure they were allowed to keep. "Okay," she said at last, almost inaudibly. "I'll stay. For now." Nate didn't push for more. He didn't smile, didn't dramatize the moment. He just stepped aside and gestured for her to come back in. She moved past him without another word, but something had changed. Her posture was different. Not exactly at ease, but not hiding either. She wasn't running anymore. Not this time. She didn't drop her bag, but she loosened her grip. As she disappeared down the hallway, Nate stood where she had left him, watching her go with a strange ache in his chest. Not pain, not relief, something deeper. She didn't thank him. She didn't have to. Her staying was the thank you. Her staying was the first sign that maybe, just maybe, she was starting to believe she wasn't the problem. And as he turned back toward the foyer, the house felt different. Not fixed, not healed, but altered. The silence remained, but it no longer felt like a threat. It felt like space, like the beginning of something. She had been ready to vanish. He had stopped her, and though she hadn't said much, the moment her eyes met his and didn't turn away, that was enough for now. Trust would take time, but she hadn't walked out the door, and that, Nate knew, meant everything. It had taken Nate nearly a month to make the trip, not because he was too busy. He had cleared his schedule within a week of Claire's departure, but because something about showing up uninvited to Alina's world felt intrusive. He didn't want to barge into her life with privilege, disguised as concern. But he couldn't stop thinking about her brother, about the photo she kept folded in her apron, about the way she had clutched her bag that day in the hallway like she had no reason to believe anyone would choose her. So he drove, no driver, no assistant. Just him, behind the wheel of a rental car that looked painfully out of place in the neighborhood he pulled into. The streets of this part of Detroit were narrow, uneven. Houses leaned a little, paint chipped easily. But there was life here, a kind of strength that didn't ask to be praised. Nate parked 2 houses down and walked the rest of the way. The house Alina had mentioned once, barely, was smaller than he'd imagined. A cracked step, a faded number on the door. But there were fresh clothes drying on a line out back. That alone told him one thing: she was trying. He had barely reached the gate when a small figure came bursting from the side of the house. A boy, maybe 8 or 9, grinning wide, holding a sheet of paper in both hands like it was something priceless. He didn't even ask who Nate was. Just ran up to him, full of energy and pride, and held up the paper. "Look," the boy said, "this is our new house. One day." Nate looked down at the drawing. Crayon lines, a bright blue triangle for a roof, yellow windows, little red flowers drawn in uneven ovals around the front door. "That's where my room's gonna be," the boy added, pointing to a scribbled box with his name, Elijah. Nate couldn't find words for a second. His throat closed with something unexplainable. The drawing was crude, innocent, beautiful. It was hope in its purest form. Not a plan, not a blueprint. Just belief. "That's a good house," Nate finally said, his voice softer than he expected. Elijah beamed. "Alina says we'll get there someday, if I do my homework and she keeps working." Nate crouched down, eye level with the boy. "Maybe I can help with that," he said, not offering charity, but something more delicate, something earned. Alina's voice cut through gently from the porch. "Elijah!" Her tone wasn't harsh, just tired. She stepped outside, saw Nate, and paused mid-step. Her body tensed, but only slightly. Her eyes scanned the scene quickly. No panic, no fear, just surprise. "Mr. Morgan?" she said slowly, like she wasn't sure if she was dreaming or being warned. Nate stood, brushing his hands on his jacket. "Didn't mean to intrude," he said. "I was nearby and thought I'd check in." A lie, but one she let slide. She stepped forward, cautious, but not cold. She looked different out here, not in uniform, jeans, a faded t-shirt. Her hair was down, looser. "You drove here?" she asked. "To this?" Her tone wasn't accusatory, just disbelieving. He nodded once. "I needed to see where you came from," he said, "because I think it matters." Alina studied him for a long moment. Then her eyes dropped to the drawing Elijah was still holding, her lips pressed together, not in a smile, but in the kind of line that people wear when they're holding back too many things at once. "You don't have to do this," she said after a while, her voice low, almost defensive. "We're fine. We're managing." But even as she said it, Nate could see the cracks behind the words. Not from lack of strength, but from exhaustion. From doing too much with too little for too long. "I'm not here to fix anything," he replied. "I just want to help carry the weight a little, if you'll let me." That phrase, "if you'll let me," landed differently. It wasn't a demand. It wasn't even a proposal. It was an offering. One that didn't assume she was broken. One that didn't treat her like a project. Alina looked at Elijah, still proudly clutching his crayon masterpiece, then back at Nate. Her shoulders relaxed by half an inch. Just that. Not a yes, not a thank you, but not a no. That was enough. "We've never had help that didn't come with a price," she said. "Then let this be the first," Nate answered. She didn't nod, she didn't smile, but she stepped aside, letting him walk a little closer. That was her answer. They didn't talk long after that. Elijah started showing Nate the flowers they were growing in plastic jugs, the ones Alina said would eventually go in front of their real house. The blue roof house, as he called it. Nate listened, asked questions, never once looked at his phone. Alina stood to the side, watching him not like a threat, but like something she hadn't decided on yet. A possibility. She didn't offer coffee. She didn't pretend to be a hostess, and that somehow made it more honest. Eventually, Nate turned to leave. He didn't promise anything, didn't hand her an envelope or mention money. He just looked at her and said, "You deserve more than survival, Alina." She didn't respond, but her eyes softened, and when she said goodbye, it wasn't cold. It wasn't careful. It was tired, but real. A closing without walls. As he walked back to the car, Nate looked once more at the drawing Elijah had pressed into his hand. He hadn't even noticed he was still holding it. The roof was still bright blue, the flowers still uneven. But now they felt closer to real than he would have thought possible. And as he drove away, he didn't feel like he had changed her life. He felt like she had changed something in his. Alina had accepted his presence, not with trust, not with gratitude, but without apology. And for someone who had lived most of her life bracing for blame, that alone was an act of quiet courage. The envelope was plain. No logo, no return address beyond a handwritten line that simply said, "Detroit, M.I." Nate almost missed it in the pile of business mail stacked neatly on his entryway console, wedged between a quarterly investor update and a courier-delivered non-disclosure agreement. He didn't recognize the handwriting at first. It wasn't flowing or ornate, just blocky and careful, like someone who hadn't written freely in a long time. He opened it without thinking, almost absent-mindedly, expecting maybe a bill, maybe something bureaucratic tied to the house in Detroit. But as soon as he unfolded the cheap lined paper and read the first sentence, he froze. The words were unmistakably hers. "We moved." Just that. Two simple words that stopped the rhythm of his day. No preamble, no context. Just news that somehow felt like a turning point. He leaned against the counter, reading slowly, the way you drink something hot you didn't know you needed. The letter wasn't long. A paragraph, maybe two. It told a whole story in under 100 words. "Elijah has his own room now," it read. "He picked the paint himself. It's too bright, but he's proud of it." Nate smiled without realizing. He could picture it, the boy with crayons, beaming with plans. "I'm working at a daycare nearby," Alina continued. "It's loud, but the kids laugh a lot. It's a different kind of tired, a better kind." There was no bitterness in the words, no shame, no lingering apology, just truth. Just her voice, clearer now, more grounded. "Thank you," the letter said next, "for seeing me, really seeing me. That line made him sit down. He reread it 3 times, those 6 words somehow heavier than any keynote speech or IPO announcement he'd ever delivered. And then at the very bottom, beside her name written in slanted script, a small hand-drawn triangle, a blue roof with 2 crooked flowers beneath it. The house from the crayon drawing. The dream taking root. For several minutes, Nate didn't move. The silence around him didn't feel oppressive for once. It felt honest, real, like the echo of something finally settling. He turned the paper over, half expecting more, but there wasn't. She hadn't asked for anything. Not money, not favors, not promises. She wasn't reporting progress like an employee. She was simply sharing a milestone, a breath, and that, more than any gesture or gift, felt sacred. He stood slowly, folded the letter with a kind of reverence, and walked it past the home office, past the trophy shelf, into the study he rarely entered these days. There, inside the top right drawer of a polished mahogany desk, one that used to hold mergers, patent filings, and 7-figure deals, he placed the letter gently among the few things he now considered untouchable. Not because they were valuable, but because they were true. It was strange how something so small could alter the weight of a room. The house didn't look different. Nothing had changed, really. But Nate could feel something in the air. Not literally. No one had opened a window. And yet, for the first time, in what felt like years, the atmosphere inside these walls felt lighter, less rehearsed, as though the house itself had exhaled, as though some stale grief or guilt had finally shifted, making room for something not yet named. He stood in the doorway of the living room, staring out toward the garden Claire had once designed and abandoned. It didn't matter anymore. The real garden was in Detroit now. Bright blue paint, loud kids, a drawing kept on a wall, a woman who no longer apologized for existing. He thought back to the first time he saw her on the security footage, barely a person, more like a shadow moving carefully through someone else's world. He had been surrounded by perfection back then. Silent dinners, sterile rooms, expensive furniture that no one sat on. And yet he had never noticed how empty it all was until he saw someone who didn't belong there move like she already knew it. And now she belonged somewhere else. Somewhere real. That meant something. That meant everything. He didn't text her, didn't call. He wouldn't cheapen her letter by responding with something digital. Maybe one day he'd write back, but not now. Now, he'd let the silence speak for itself. Because sometimes the most profound way to honor someone's courage is to receive it without trying to add to it. He stood for a while longer, then turned off the lights, letter still echoing in his mind. The house no longer felt like a monument to something lost. It felt, finally, like it had a door open, like it could begin again, not through renovations or guests or luxury, but through truth. Through the choice to see people as they are, not as they're arranged. The letter hadn't just told him where she lived, it reminded him of where he stood. And as he closed the drawer gently, the air in the room shifted, subtle but undeniable, as if someone had, at last, opened the windows from the inside. Nate stood on the porch, eyes fixed on the garden swing that now swayed gently in the breeze, even though no one had touched it in hours. It was a simple thing, installed quietly 2 weeks earlier, without fanfare or announcement. Just a small wooden bench suspended by thick rope beneath the strongest branch of the old maple. He hadn't told anyone why he wanted it there, not Marta, not his board of directors, not even himself, in concrete words. But he knew that swing wasn't a decoration. It was a memory made visible. It was a gesture left in the soil, a soft echo of a boy who might return or might not. And the possibility of that, of a return not guaranteed but possible, had given the house a strange kind of peace. Nate had stopped measuring his days by meetings or milestones. Lately, he measured them in silence, in letters folded neatly, in how long the swing moved after the wind touched it. And today, it moved longer than usual. Marta stepped outside with the dish towel still in hand, wiping at flour that clung to her apron like a badge of duty. She wasn't just the cook anymore, not in a house that had begun to unravel its old rules. She paused at the top of the steps and looked at him, then past him, at the swing. "She coming back?" she asked plainly, not like someone eager for gossip, but like someone who had learned to hope carefully. Nate didn't answer right away. He watched the ropes sway and heard the creak they made. Not unpleasant, just old wood remembering what it was built for. His voice, when it came, was low, almost reverent. "She doesn't need to come back," he said. "She left what matters." Marta nodded, but her face betrayed the emotion beneath. There was admiration there, and something like relief. "It's quieter now," she said, "but not the same kind of quiet." Nate agreed silently. The house was still, but it was no longer holding its breath. He thought about the day Claire left, the slammed door, the way the windows seemed to shake with it, how the silence afterward had felt sharp, like broken glass underfoot. But this was different. This was a silence that didn't wound. It was the sound of something mending bit by bit. Nate didn't expect Alina to return. He knew better now than to believe people belonged to places just because they left something behind in them. But what she had left wasn't furniture or clothes or work half done. She had left proof that the house could be something more than what it had been. A place where dignity was possible, a place where people could breathe, that was more permanent than any lease or legal document. And Elijah had left a dream behind, a drawing turned into a symbol, a future imagined in bright blue and uneven crayon lines. It lived here now, like a quiet promise pinned between memory and wish. Nate had started journaling, not daily, not with structure, just a few sentences at the end of a night, scribbled in a notebook that had once belonged to Claire, repurposed now for something redemptive. He didn't always write about Alina. Sometimes he wrote about choices, sometimes about fear, sometimes about the way Elijah had looked at him, like men do in dreams, before you know their names. But it always came back to the same truth. Seeing someone, truly seeing them, changes you. It doesn't save you. It doesn't fix what you broke, but it shifts something irreversible inside. Alina had been seen, finally, and in doing so, she had given Nate something no merger or investment ever had, the ability to recognize himself not in power, but in presence, not in fixing, but in listening. Marta sat on the porch railing now, beside him but not pressing him. She was quiet, she said softly. But that girl had a strength I don't think I've seen in anyone. Nate nodded. She still does, he replied. She always did. And that was the truth. Alina didn't grow stronger by surviving. She had been strong in the surviving itself. What changed was how the world responded to that strength. What changed was him. And now, in the stillness, he wasn't waiting for noise. He was learning to hear what silence held. That was where healing had begun, in the spaces between words, in the swing that moved with no one on it, in the breath of a house finally at rest. It didn't need applause. It didn't need closure. It needed acknowledgement. And Nate had finally learned to give it. As a breeze moved through the yard again, lifting a few fallen leaves into gentle motion, Nate tilted his head and listened. Not for footsteps, not for a car pulling into the driveway, but for something subtler. And in the rustle of branches, in the hush that followed, he could swear just for a second he heard it, a faint humming, the kind of tune someone sings when they're alone, not for show, not for anyone, just for the comfort of surviving, just for the joy of it. He didn't chase the sound, didn't name it. He just let it pass through him, like light through old glass. Then he looked back at the swing again and whispered to no one in particular, "She left what matters." And this time, the silence that followed didn't close around him. It opened. We put our hearts into every story we share here, and this one was no exception. At Story Sphere, we're more than just a channel. We're a growing family of people who believe that stories can heal, reveal, and connect us in ways nothing else can. If this story moved you even a little, please consider subscribing. It helps us keep bringing powerful, real, and human stories like this to life. And we'd truly love to hear your voice. Share your thoughts in the comments, explore more of our videos, and help us continue building a space where every silent voice can finally be heard. Thank you for being here with us.